The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, author William Ayers debunks the myth that teachers' unions are bad for public education. Elizabeth Lower-Basch of the Center on Law and Social Policy explains what's wrong with Donald Trump's approach to welfare reform. And Bill Press talks with Democratic strategist and former Ohio State Senator Capri Cafaro. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Elizabeth Lower-Basch has a long history inside and outside of government figuring out the best ways to help struggling families. She says that new work requirements for people on public assistance is exactly not the way to do that. And we say hello to Elizabeth Lower-Basch, who's director of the Income and Work Supports Team at the Center for Law and Social Policy. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
Well, thank you so much for having me to talk about this important topic.
Absolutely, and it is our pleasure. You know, with his sights on overhauling the nation's safety net, President Trump has opened the door to new orders that put in place work requirements for people receiving various kinds of federal assistance. First, explain to us what exactly is a work requirement.
Sure. So the basic idea behind the work requirement is that if someone who's receiving some sort of basic need assistance, so that could be cash or food or health care or housing, doesn't work a minimum number of hours or participate in another required activity and doesn't prove that they're working those hours, they can be cut off from receiving those benefits. And in some cases, their family can lose the benefits as well.
Wow. How many of these work requirements have actually been put in place so far? And what kind of benefits are we talking about that are at risk?
So cash assistance under temporary assistance for needy families, which is known by the really awful acronym of TANF, has had work requirements since it was created in 1996. SNAP, or food stamps, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program is the full official title these days, has work requirements for some populations and has had for decades. But the president and the House Republicans are proposing to expand those requirements to almost everyone who gets food stamps. And they are also approving waiver requests from states that want to impose work requirements as a condition of getting health care under the Medicaid program. And finally, most recently, we're hearing proposals to apply work requirements in housing programs. So it's really showing up all over the place.
I was going to say, I mean, that's covering a huge amount of that population that needs this assistance. In understanding what doesn't work with work requirements, let's start with some of the core assumptions. What are the stereotypes embedded in these programs? Well, the first stereotype behind the work requirements is that people who are participating in these programs are not currently working. And certainly for both SNAP and Medicaid, a large share of the working age population in these programs are working. And it's just that they are in jobs that either don't provide health insurance or don't pay enough for them to feed their families. So that's the first big stereotype. The second big stereotype is that people don't want to work, that if they're not working, that they need to be forced to work. Whereas the reality is that overwhelmingly people do want to work, but are struggling with other things that are preventing them from doing so. We're speaking with Elizabeth Lower-Basch, director of the Income and Work Supports Team at the Center for Law and Social Policy here today on AmericasDemocrats.org. Elizabeth, we already have data that shows the impact of mandatory work programs. First of all, what type of effect do we see on employment and earnings?
the basic answer is we see very little effect on earnings and really on employment either. People are often able to find low-wage jobs on their own, and that's really what happens when they participate in these programs. Some people find jobs, but most of them would have been able to find jobs even if they hadn't had these requirements. The reality of low-wage work is that people move in and out of jobs, and when they're out of work is when they're most likely to apply for help. And so even if you did absolutely nothing, you would see more people moving into the workforce.
Mm-hmm. Who are the people most affected by these requirements?
Well, it's really pretty much everyone. People who are quite likely to not be able to comply with the requirements include people who might have a work limitation, a disability, but that doesn't qualify them for disability benefits. All the programs sort of say, oh, well, we're only going to apply this to people who are able to work, but we know from TANF and SNAP, which have had work requirements, that many people with disabilities do lose benefits. Also, people who can't find work for other reasons. We know people who are returning citizens who have been, previous histories of incarceration often find it incredibly difficult to find jobs. People don't want to take a chance on them, and this would just be another blow, keeping them out of getting benefits. And finally, we know that people who are working are going to lose benefits from these requirements because they won't be able to keep up with the paperwork to track their hours.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's amazing to me is you have so many people that are working multiple jobs, but because they have perhaps no education or for whatever reason, they're very low level paying jobs. They've got two jobs. They still can't afford to support their family, and they're affected by this. And it just, something's wrong with a system like that. You know, you argue that work requirements show a profound misunderstanding of the realities of low-wage jobs. Can you expand on that for us, please?
Sure. It's just what we were saying, that, people are often patching together multiple jobs. There's a lot of unpredictable scheduling where you might not know until Sunday night which days you're going to be working. And if you don't keep your schedule free for those hours of work, you might not get any hours scheduled. So the idea that someone can just say, oh, well, I'm only working 15 hours this week, I'll just go to my boss and tell them I need to have 20 hours every week is just unfortunately not the way the labor market works. And
we're in a gig economy, so there are only going to be more people that are affected in that regard, where you don't know when your next day of work is coming.
Right, and sort of the whole paperwork we're thinking about how if you're self-employed and maybe you're starting off and you're not turning a profit yet, and whether people will get credit for that. And it's crazy because each of these programs has different rules, is the way they're setting it up. So someone might have 4 different sets of requirements for 4 different programs.
Mm-hmm. And again, we're speaking with Elizabeth Lower-Basch, Director of the Income and Work Supports Team at the Center for Law and Social Policy. Elizabeth, your research shows that even when some people are meeting their work requirements, they still lose benefits. How does that happen? And what does it tell us about work requirements being enforced?
Right. So this is what I was saying about the paperwork, that many of these proposals suggest that people would have to report their hours of work every month. I know at least one state says you'd have to do it online. So if you live in a place where you don't have access to high-speed internet or you don't have a computer at home, you might be out of luck having to do, another trip to some place where you couldn't get online to report your hours. And the reality is people's lives are busy, and sometimes they might not submit the paperwork on time. Other times even they do submit the paperwork on time and the caseworker doesn't get to it, or it gets lost in the mail. And we know there's a lot of churning that's created, and that's stressful for the clients, and it also uses up caseworkers' time. There's one study from Minnesota that found that under TANF programs, the caseworkers were literally spending half their time just tracking down hours of participation and not doing any work with the clients that might help them get a better job.
And as you acknowledged earlier, most people who receive public benefits, they do want to work. What would a program look like that actually helped them achieve that goal?
Right. So there's, I think, two pieces of it. One is sometimes what you really need is job creation and subsidized employment programs. Those have gotten a lot more attention at the national scale in the last year than they've been recently discussed. But we actually have an example from something that was called the TANF Emergency Fund that was created as part of the Recovery Act in 2010. And 39 states used some of the funds under that to create subsidized employment programs for people who really wanted to work and couldn't find jobs. And these are states of Democratic governors, states of Republican governors. It was wildly popular. So that's one real opportunity. And then the other piece is education and training. And as you said, the best predictor of employment is having credentials and skills that are valued in the labor force. And so programs that actually help people get those skills and credentials can make a real difference.
Except there's not enough, it seems to me anyway, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there just doesn't seem to be enough emphasis on those couple of things that you just mentioned. And I don't understand why we keep tearing away at education when we all know that a better education is exactly what you need to survive.
Right, and that's one of the things that's been incredibly frustrating, as I said, under TANF, cash assistance, which has had work requirements for 20 years, is that people don't really get credit for that, for going to college on an ongoing basis. That they have to somehow struggle to combine parenting and going to school and working in order to keep getting the tiny amount of cash that they can get under TANF. So it's really counterproductive to long-term self-security.
Just amazing. Elizabeth Lower-Basch, Director of the Income and Work Supports Team at the Center for Law and Social Policy, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Elizabeth, we do appreciate your time with us today and look forward to having you back again with us soon. Okay,
well, thanks so much.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, William Ayers flips the script on some popular myths about teachers and unions. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Get ready, America. Here we go to war. Generalissimo Trump, whose nom de guerre is El Donaldo, the mucho macho presidente of the USA, is personally directing the hostilities in this assault on, surprise, the USA. Well, not every American. He's specifically mounting a war on our country's poor people, though he euphemistically calls it a war of liberation. The purpose, he says, is to, quote, free poor families from food stamps, Medicaid, housing assistance, and America's other programs that alleviate poverty. Welfare, he snarls, as he and his militant lieutenants conduct ruthless slash-and-burn forays to defund and destroy such benefits. Their rationale is that eliminating anti-poverty assistance will not only save billions of tax dollars and reduce the federal budget deficit, but it'll also provide a moral incentive for poor people to get jobs and work their way up to prosperity, like El Donaldo and his billionaire buddies did. Actually, Trump inherited a real estate fortune from his daddy Fred, and he expanded it by relying on billions of dollars in government subsidies, tax breaks, and special favors. As for working, most poor people already have jobs, but the miserly pay of those jobs mire them in poverty and drudgery. Even more significant, the vicious, laissez-faire-land sense of moral superiority possessed by pampered political elites like Trump lead them to be intentionally cruel to the poor. This is Jim Hightower saying he, his cabinet of multimillionaires, and such coke-headed congressional ideologues as GOP House Speaker Paul Ryan and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell are so disdainful of the needy that they have a perverse impulse to punish them, as though being poor is not punishment enough. It's said that war is hell, but their war on the poor is truly satanic.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. William Ayers is one of America's leading voices on the role of education in building democracy. In his newest book, he argues that activist teachers have a vital part to play in that vision. And we say hello to William Ayers, an author, activist, and educator whose previous books include To Teach, The Journey of a Teacher, and Teaching Toward Freedom, Moral Commitment and Ethical Action in the Classroom. His latest book, written with co-authors Crystal Laura and Rick Ayers, is titled You Can't Fire the Bad Ones, and 18 Other Myths About Teachers, Teachers' Unions, and Public Education. Bill Ayers, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Glad to be here, Jim. Thanks very much.
Well, and our pleasure to have you with us. Let's start with the myth that earned its way to the title of the book, You Can't Fire the Bad Ones. Explain the myth and the reality of teacher tenure.
Well, the way that we have organized the book is we outline several myths, 19 in total, that pretty much add up to what is the corporate school reform agenda. And then we have a reality. We name the myth, language of people who are perpetrating it, and that includes the New York Times, National Public Radio, politicians from both political parties, and so on. And then we try to knock it down with a reality check. So you've heard it 1,000 times that somehow teachers with their horrible unions are defending tenure and really terrible people are in the classroom. And that's kind of what is out there in the public discourse. And we try to do two things. One is we try to do a reality check as well. Let's test the hypothesis that somehow unions, their special interest and their protection of terrible teachers. I think one of our cited people says that the AFT would defend a dead teacher in the classroom. That's how extreme they are. So we break it down and we say, well, look, if teachers' unions were really the scourge of student achievement, if they were really the problem, that's an easy hypothesis to test. And so we could look at the states that don't allow teachers' unions, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, West Virginia, Arizona, etc. And you would think, well, they must have fabulous test scores, which is the major metric that these reformers believe in. And the truth is, no, they have the worst test scores. So that's the first way we take on the myth. But the second thing is, we note that, for example, the New Yorker spends several thousand words on an essay a couple of years ago that many of your listeners might remember, which is based on an ethnographic account of the Rubber Room, which is a space in the central office where teachers who've been declared unable to stay in the classroom for either alcoholism or committing some egregious crime. So they're waiting for their cases to be adjudicated. So the New Yorker does a several thousand word essay. It's kind of lip-smackingly interesting because it's really some crazy people, but it's 15 teachers out of a system of several tens of thousands. So you end up with a several thousand word essay describing 0.0005% of New York's teachers. It's not that it's uninteresting, but is it really the center of the thing as we understand it? The truth is, what we call teachers' contracts are in fact teacher board contracts. They're negotiated. They have reasonable kinds of stipulations like due process if you're being disciplined or fired. And that's true of every level of employment, not just teachers. So that's the way we take that myth on.
Now, why are these particular myths about teachers so embedded, do you think, in our political discourse?
Well, I think it has more to do with the money behind it and more to do with the kind of repetition of the myths than it does any kind of tie to reality. I mean, simple example that we all are familiar with is that when any politician gets to a microphone and says we need to get the lazy, incompetent teachers out of the classroom, which we've heard thousands of times over the last 4 decades, I mean, I find myself nodding dully. What am I going to do? Say, no, keep the lazy, incompetent teacher there for my granddaughter. Now, of course, we agree once you set that frame, but the problem is it's not naming a real problem. So if I get to the microphone first and I have a different framing of the issue and I say every kid in an American public school deserves an intellectually grounded, morally committed, caring, compassionate, well-rested, well-paid teacher in the classroom, I win that argument. So it's really a matter of framing. And this little book of ours is an attempt to reframe the major issues that are part of the public debate about public education today.
There's another myth that you dispel, and that is that anyone can be a teacher. Some may see that as an aspirational message. How does it actually undermine education?
Well, I think it is aspirational in some ways, Jim. In fact, I think that we should say, look, if you're looking around for a profession or an occupation or a career that really gives you the opportunity to do moral work, ethical work, to really use your mind, yes, teaching is a great, great alternative for you, but it's not something you can just glide into. And this is a problem we have because everybody has known a teacher. Everybody's been in school. My brother, who's one of the co-authors of this book with me, calls this edu-splaining, which is a relationship to mansplaining. You know the concept of mansplaining? That's where men explain things to women which they already know better than, and it's kind of become part of our language. It was a brilliant kind of term invented by Rebecca Solnit. But my brother says, anytime, he's a legendary high school teacher, and he says, anytime you say to somebody, I'm a teacher, they say, oh, let me tell you what's wrong with the schools, or let me tell you what I think teaching ought to be. It happens to us all the time. So the idea that it's something that everybody knows and you just step into it, and this gets institutionalized with things like Teach for America. And I should say parenthetically that the kids who go in to Teach for America are overwhelmingly wonderful, wonderful people with the idea that they're going to make a difference in people's lives. The problem is teaching isn't that easy. It actually, no teacher who's taught for any period of time will tell you that it's something you do well on day one. It's something that takes 5 years to even get yourself up and running. So the idea that you could kind of have a summer of workshops and then step into the worst school in America and make a difference, it's disproven by the data, and it's disproven by the experience of 30 years of Teach for America.
We're speaking with author, activist, educator Bill Ayers, talking about his latest book, co-written with Crystal Laura and Rick Ayers, as you just mentioned. You Can't Fire the Bad Ones, and 18 Other Myths About Teachers, Teachers' Unions, and Public Education. And teachers' unions, Bill, they hold a special place in our mythology, often cited as the biggest obstacle to improving education today. Please deconstruct this one for us.
Well, I mean, what we're seeing, Jim, all over the country suddenly, and I have to say, I didn't predict it, and neither did you, and no one listening to this predicted it, that in the red states, in right-to-work states, or what we call right-to-work for less states, there is a revolution rising, and it's an extraordinary social movement disguised as a conflict. But these are not certified teachers' unions. These are teachers who are fed up and angry and hopeful that they can actually defend public education, which is under a pretty steady attack. So, as I said earlier, if teachers' unions were the biggest obstacle to student achievement, then you would expect the places that don't allow teachers' unions would do fabulously, and the opposite is true. This is also true, incidentally, internationally. places like Canada and Norway, in which every teacher must belong to a union, do very, very well on the international competition. And places that don't allow unions do much, much more poorly. The other thing I would look at is I'm always interested in looking at what the elite have for their kids. What do they have that the rest of us deserve? And if you look at where Arne Duncan, the former Secretary of Education, look at where Barack Obama, look at where Rahm Emanuel send their kids, they send their kids to the University of Chicago laboratory schools. What do they find in the lab schools? Well, they find a class size capped at 15. They find based in part on the kids' own interests, but importantly, and a full program, but importantly, they also find a unionized teacher corps that speaks with a collective voice when it comes to matters not just of benefits and wages, but what is best practice and how can the wisdom of teachers be at the table. The collective voice of teachers is not a bad thing. It's an essential thing. And so we make the case that not that any existing teachers union is what we're supporting. We're supporting the idea that good working conditions make good conditions, good teaching conditions make good learning conditions. How do you get good working conditions? You have the collective voice of teachers at the table.
You know, there's obviously another myth that we want to talk about. Teacher activists are troublemakers, and I think we've actually seen quite the opposite recently myself. That's my interpretation, of course. What happens to teachers who become activists, and why should they continue to risk a career to do so?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily true that they're risking a career. I think that we have to remember, first of all, that teachers are just, human beings for 6 hours a day or 8 hours a day. They actually are citizens as well. They are residents of this country. They have the right to express themselves and to express their views on issues. But it's actually more important in some ways, in my mind, that teachers speak out on the issues of the day. And the reason is because in a democracy where we want everyone to learn the arts of liberty, the arts of dialogue, the arts of imagination and curiosity, teachers are in a perfect position to not only express their opinions, not to punish people who don't share that opinion, but to show that one can be involved in kind of a common discourse, and one can do it with civility, with persuasiveness, but also with humility. So my argument is that activists are people, when the kind of status quo says all's well, the activist is the one who says, no, things could be better. And we can speak up with the possibility of being heard, and we can also listen with the possibility of being changed. That's the essence of dialogue, and that's the essence of democracy. It should be true in every classroom that we have this kind of discourse. One of the things I find fascinating about the Parkland students, if you read more deeply than just the gun incident and their gun activism, the fact is this is a school where kids learn to do performance, kids learn to be in debate clubs, and so it wasn't new for them. I mean, so many people looked at those kids and said, holy cow, how did they become so brilliant, so sophisticated, so capable? And the answer is they were in a school that encouraged curiosity, imagination, initiative, courage. We should do that in every school.
Mm-hmm. Amen to that. As you consider this moment in time with teachers' strikes taking place across the country, civil disturbances, I might add, do you see these actions as an expression of an activist teachers movement?
Well, in a sense, but I actually see it as something even more profound than that. It actually gets its start in Chicago 6 years ago when the Chicago Teachers Union went toe-to-toe with Mayor Rahm Emanuel for a 6-day strike. The strike was limited by law to be about wages and benefits. But in reality, it was a social movement. And what you saw in downtown Chicago every night during that strike was 10 to 20,000 citizens arm in arm with teachers saying, we want good public schools. We want what the privileged people have. We want the arts. We want librarians. We want counselors. We want nurses. Now, none of that was on the negotiating table. So what we saw in Chicago was a social movement performed as a labor conflict. That's what we're seeing in West Virginia, Arizona, Colorado, and it's sweeping the country. Look at Arizona, where they've cut billions of dollars from education under this ideology that somehow tax cuts are the holy grail of what politics should be about. Look, every government in all through time and all over the world, all they do is tax and spend. The thing they have to argue about is tax whom, how much, and spend on what. These teachers, arm in arm with parents and community, are saying, we want you to spend on education and health and jobs. We don't want you to spend on war and incarceration and the rest of it. So that's a debate we should be having. And frankly, teachers and parents from West Virginia have started something that is not going to be put to sleep very easily.
Mm-hmm. Now, as we approach the midterm elections, Bill, what's the message that you want to hear from progressive Democrats that supports teachers and the mission of public education?
Well, I don't care if it's progressive Democrats or anybody else. What I want is for people to understand that education is a human right. It's encoded in Article 26, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's also encoded in every state constitution in our country. Education is a human right. It's not a product to be bought and sold at the marketplace. If it's a product, a lot of the idiocy that we've seen in the last 4 decades makes sense, like privatizing the public space, like reducing education to a single metric on a high-stakes test score, like doing away with the collective voice of teachers. That's what we got. But what we need is a recognition that as a human right, there's a lot that follows from that, including that every child should be able to find within reach a decent public school that's fully staffed, forward-looking, fully equipped, and not have to go searching through moving to the suburbs or through applying for a voucher or through, none of that makes sense if education is a human right. Everyone has a right to it. Everyone has an equitable right to it. And that's what I'd like to hear coming out of the political debates going forward.
Before we let you go, how do you hope people will use this book?
Well, in many ways, the book couldn't have anticipated, but is fully in line with this wildfire strike sweeping the South and now sweeping North. And that is, we would like people to have this in their back pocket or in their backpack next to their bottle of water and bottle of vitamin E, so that they recognize that this is a weapon in the struggle to define our way forward in public education. If you want to defend public education, if you want the arguments under one cover in a coherent, simple way, we're not necessarily leading this, but we tried to sum it up. Here you have a book that gives you the arguments, the evidence that you need at the next school board meeting, at the next neighborhood gathering, at the next political debate.
You Can't Fire the Bad Ones, and 18 Other Myths About Teachers, Teachers' Unions, and Public Education. The author joining us today, Bill Ayers, of course, co-authored by Crystal Laura and Rick Ayers. Bill, I can't tell you how much we appreciate your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org, and hopefully we can have you back with us again soon.
Thanks very much, Jim.
You're quite welcome. And thank you for being here. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Democratic strategist Capri Cafaro for the takeaways from the Ohio primary elections.
Pleased to welcome back to the studio. She's all over the place, but we catch her when she's in Washington. Capri Cafaro, Democratic strategist and former state senator from the great state of Ohio. Hi, Capri. Nice to see you. And you've had a busy week with Ohio, right up there. Of all the primaries, Ohio probably got the most attention.
With the exception of West Virginia, thanks to Blankenship.
Thanks to Blankenship, yeah.
It's all about Blankenship in that one.
Unwanted attention in some cases.
True this.
Yeah.
Did you see yesterday Donald Trump called Blankenship?
No, I did not see that.
Yeah.
And said what exactly?
I don't know. I mean, and why? I mean, yeah.
After he tweeted out and said, don't vote for him?
Don't vote for him, and dumped on him, saying he couldn't win and everything.
Well, I mean,
I just saw a little note somewhere this morning.
Weird.
That
is odd.
That he called him. Yeah, right.
Well, I guess we'll never know.
Yeah, I mean, breaking news, the president is kind of weird sometimes.
Yeah. At any rate, we've been at it here for a little while before you joined us. Peter, tell us about...
Yes, indeed.
Stir up some dust, or that's what
always.
we
Okay, great.
Always.
I'm ready.
We are on Twitter at BP Show, where you can find us and give us some comments. My man Romaine says, Haspel talking about her moral compass won't allow her to torture again. I say sorry, your moral compass has already been proven to be broken. Our friend, talking about the North Korea prisoner release, Phil says, is it cynical to say that Kim created leverage by arresting our guys just for this very moment?
Nope.
No.
I don't think that's too cynical at all.
Right.
I don't think that's too cynical at all. We had another tweeter saying, Trump is a train wreck and taking the rest of us with him. Oil prices will skyrocket.
Oh, because of the Iran deal.
Because of the Iran deal.
Know that.
And KG, who we hear from often, the very succinct tweet, this is why people hate the government. Which I'm not sure which topic we talked about in particular. But I guess take your pick.
You know what? Michael Cohen.
Yeah, probably.
We're talking about
that's true.
Selling access to the White House. That's probably why.
By the way, we're also on
on
YouTube, youtube.com/The Bill Press Show, where we stream the show out live, and we keep the whole show up there if you want to go watch it anytime throughout the day. Johnny says, the fact that the USA left, this is the Iran deal, is so spineless is what frightens me about 2020. They might win the Democratic primaries and then get slaughtered in the general. Which is not exactly optimistic. And Donna talking about Gina Haspel, it was sickening when she brought up her dad and how she was brought up with a strong moral compass, considering what we know she did. If you have a comment for us, find us on Twitter at BP Show.
By the way, agree or disagree, right? You know, we're thick-skinned. You can
sure
disagree.
Absolutely.
Sure. At BP Show on Twitter, and also on YouTube, youtube.com/The Bill Press Show.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about this Ohio primary. Richard Cordray pretty handily beating Dennis Kucinich. I was surprised at the margin there. Were you?
Not necessarily. I expected it to be a little bit closer, but I think that the conventional wisdom was that Rich Cordray was going to win. The interesting thing about the Ohio governor's race is that it started out 18 months ago with 3 women and 1 man. The 1 man was my former colleague, Senator Joe Schiavone, who actually stood in to the entire end and got 10% of the vote, worked very, very hard. I actually voted for Joe, frankly, because I think he could bring some of the Trump voters back into the fold for Democrats. But Rich Cordray and Dennis Kucinich both.
So there was a third candidate in the.
There was 4. The fourth actually was was an Ohio Supreme Court justice who quit to run, but he was goofy to say the least. So it was. I don't think anyone, even though he was on the Supreme Court in Ohio, nobody really took him very seriously. So you had a situation where you had all these women running, and Joe, 18 months ago. Systematically, the women were dropping out. Rich Cordray got in, took Betty Sutton, who was a former member of Congress who was running for governor, made her his lieutenant governor pick. And sort of the rest is history. So, Rich, as I think everyone knows, was the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB, for 8 years. So he was in D.C. And then Dennis Kucinich really, he lost due to redistricting in 2012, his seat in Congress, and has kind of been in and out of Ohio and D.C. and every place else for the last 6 years. So these two guys swoop back in. They have huge name recognition, but really didn't put a whole lot of effort into the sort of grassroots campaigning of connecting with voters. So there was a lot of people, 40% of Ohio Democrats were undecided all the way up to the end. I know people that were not sure what they were going to do.
When they walked in.
Cordray is not honestly particularly well liked. Dennis, I think people felt was a real long shot in the general election, just given, particularly his issues with Assad, and that sort of thing. And people thought that Joe Schiavone didn't have the name recognition to sort of cut through. So here we are with Rich Cordray and Betty Sutton.
Up against Mike DeWine, is former U.S. Senator.
Former member of Congress, former lieutenant governor.
And AG, right?
Current attorney general.
Yeah.
Here's a fun fact. Mike DeWine beat Rich Cordray when Rich Cordray was the sitting attorney general in 2010.
Oh, really?
So that's a thing that makes me scratch my head. I'm like, why are we signing up for this rematch? But look, I mean, I think Democrats struggle with having a bench. All across the country. Again, one of the reasons that I was excited for Senator Schiavone, because he's my age and he comes from the Mahoning Valley, and we need to bring more of those people in. So I think it was good he ran, even if he lost. And I think Rich Cordray, will be a solid candidate. Because of his support from President Obama and Elizabeth Warren, in particular, he's going to have and his support from Labor. That ticket was endorsed by the AFL-CIO. They'll have a big fundraising apparatus, but it's going to be tough to beat Mike DeWine. I mean, we are a center-right state at this point, and I think being inside the Beltway is going to hurt him from CFPB.
We all hate hypotheticals, but at the same time, I'm going to ask you a hypothetical. If he had run, would Tim Ryan be a stronger candidate against Mike DeWine?
Yes. I don't say that just because Tim's my homie, because he is my member of Congress, and we both live in the same county and everything else. We're good friends, and I have a lot of respect for Tim. But I think for the argument that I was making about Schiavone, I think also applies to Tim, that here's somebody who can speak to the Trump voter and can, is plain talking, does have more of a populist economic message, is not necessarily, traded on his more progressive social stances, has been outspoken, is kind of seen as a man of the people. Whereas, Rich Cordray, again, he's the head of this agency that has a lot of controversy surrounding it. A big thing that happened in the primary was, he left it in the hands of Donald Trump. And people saw, and so there were two things that we thought might make Dennis Kucinich actually be more competitive. One was this,
walking away.
You walked
CFPB.
away and let the roosters run the hen house, Rich Cordray. Why did you do that for your own political gain? And two, the issue of guns played a huge part in this primary, because Rich had a stronger record with the NRA. And Dennis Kucinich really played on that and really, forcing the issue of an assault weapons ban.
Right. So when you look across, we mentioned just briefly West Virginia, Blankenship coming in third. But when you look across the field at the primaries Tuesday, what do you see particularly for Democrats?
Well, I mean, I think that it seems as if, again, if you just look at who came out of the primaries, you have this Braun that came out of the primary in Indiana, who will now challenge incumbent Joe Donnelly.
By the way, just to jump in there, Braun, who beat two Republican members of Congress.
Exactly.
So those are two Republican members of Congress who are not coming back.
That's right. Which has you were absolutely right. Brings a direct potential impact for pickups on the House side of the ledger. Yeah. Braun tries to position himself because he was a business person, but he also was a state representative in Indiana as kind of this outsider insider guy. Donnelly won in 2012. He had kind of a kooky candidate against him then, who said some really controversial stuff about rape and pregnancy. Indiana's a red state, but I think that, Donnelly has a good shot of holding on. I think Manchin still has a good shot of holding on, although, the attorney general who won that instead of Blankenship certainly is a stronger contender. And I think Sherrod holds on against Renacci.
But by the way, also in West Virginia, Patrick Marcy, the attorney general who won, beat a Republican member of Congress. So that's one more Republican member of Congress who lost the seat.
Can we talk about North Carolina in that regard?
And then North Carolina, an incumbent member of Congress,
lost
Rob
to the primary.
Pittenger, loses in the primary.
To a pretty hardcore right-wing conservative reverend who I guess was, an advocate in regards to anti-LGBT and all that bathroom bill stuff that, was out there. So I think that there are concerns. And I think it's a really good opportunity for a Democratic pickup there because of the candidate who's an Iraq war vet and, I think more reflective of the district.
So certainly one message seems to be that for a Republican incumbent member of Congress, it wasn't a good
People just don't like the swamp.
Yeah, right, exactly. Even though some of these people were saying they were Trumpers and everything, they said they were part of the Washington establishment. The other thing is, if you look across the board, and I forget the numbers now, women did very well, on Tuesday. This article from Vox.com Democratic women in particular had a great showing in Ohio, Indiana, North Carolina, West Virginia, the states we're talking about.
Right.
22 Democratic female candidates won their respective primaries. 5 Republican women candidates were the winners. So that's pretty impressive.
It is pretty impressive. And I think that part of it is just down to the fact that, we've talked on the show before about, sort of the resistance movement and the Women's March and everything.
And they're motivated.
And they are motivated. And I think on the Democratic side of the ledger, traditionally we do field more women candidates anyway. But, you look at the statistics of how many women have inquired, for example, with Emily's List between, 2015 and 2017, it's, went from like 80 to like 900. So we're seeing that bear in the outcomes of the primary already.
Why aren't you running?
Nothing for me to run for. I'm term limited. Tim Ryan's my member of Congress. I can't add, so I can't be treasurer. I don't really know what the auditor of state does. I'm not good at election law. It's not my ballywick. And I'm not a lawyer. I would run for attorney general. So there you go.
Well, okay. But I mean, you were a state senator and a good one, right? And you must.
So I hope
you know how to run campaigns. You know how to, you haven't given up on the idea of elective office, have you?
Oh, no, absolutely not. I miss working with people. I'm involved in a lot back at home in Ohio on a number of boards from, our free clinics and domestic violence shelters to Youngstown State University's Board of Trustees. So I'm very active at home. And you never know what the future will hold. But, right now I don't see a good fit or opportunity because it's not about being on the ballot. It's about being in the place where you can best serve the community.
Capri Cafaro with us, Democratic strategist, and people can follow you
at the Honorable CSC
on Twitter at the Honorable CSC,
which are my initials, and it's the Honorable not because I think I'm so honorable necessarily, but because when you're elected, you get stuck with the title of the Honorable. So I figured the easiest way to keep my Twitter handle consistent.
Sure, and people know you, and people know you that way. What do you make of the whole Stormy Daniels thing? Where is this going?
I don't know. It's interesting because every day we get a new sort of development out of her lawyer, Michael Avenatti. I think it's less about, the polls show that people don't necessarily care about having an affair with Stormy Daniels. Nobody cares, whether it's his base or frankly, even people that don't like Trump. They're like, okay, whatever. This was 10 years ago. It's expected. He kind of has this reputation. He's been married 3 times. That's not the issue. The issue here is, one of cover up, one of, using this money to potentially pay her off right before the election, the compounding confusion that has been caused by Rudy Giuliani surrounding this issue. That really has.
Would you hire Rudy Giuliani as your attorney?
I think there's a lot of people that are scratching their head and really probably changing their views on sort of the intellect and effectiveness of Rudy Giuliani. He was America's mayor. He did a lot of good things, but I have no idea what he's doing and why he's doing it and why he's saying these things. Because he's not a Fox commentator. He's the president's lawyer. He's part of the president's legal team. And there is a significant difference. It's one thing to pontificate and speculate.
Yeah,
it's a whole other thing to, go out there and say the stuff that he said in the capacity that he has.
Right. And he hasn't helped the case.
No, he's done the absolute opposite of that. So, I think that's the Stormy Daniels situation pulled a thread that I think, and, hit a domino, whatever kind of analogy you want to use, that is going to have this widespread effect that it has nothing to do with Stormy Daniels and everything to do with questions surrounding implications of pay to play, federal election law violations, paying for access to the president elect at the time. A whole host of other issues. So this is just the beginning, not the end.
Yeah, and Cohen suddenly just seems to be like toxic, for Trump. You got the Stormy Daniels thing that was bad enough, and now you got taking the money from the Russian oligarch, selling access to the White House. Who's
under sanctions, by the way. That Russian oligarch is under sanctions by the United States government right now.
I didn't realize.
Of course he is.
Yeah, of course
he
is. Would be,
but his shell company that paid Michael Cohen is a shell company based in the United States who say, we don't have anything to do with this Russian oligarch. However, there's no indication that that's actually true. That Russian oligarch has subsequently been placed under sanctions in the last round of sanctions when they I don't know, a couple months ago.
Right. And he's taking money from him and from Novartis and AT&T.
AT&T.
They're all paying him. As, by the way, they were paying other people, Lewandowski, Corey Lewandowski and others.
It's not necessarily illegal.
No. But anybody who they thought who could sell themselves as having some access to Donald Trump, right, could put themselves out there and say, I can get you in the front door.
Right. And I don't necessarily, I honestly don't know how different that is from other.
It happens all the time.
It happens all the time. And that, frankly, you talk about campaign finance reform. Obviously, there seems to be a need for some ethics reform surrounding that particular issue. Because from what I understand, Michael Cohen, Corey Lewandowski et al. Are not registered lobbyists either. So, if you're a registered lobbyist, if you're a registered lobbyist and you're being paid to use your relationships, that's one thing, and that's regulated and that is disclosed. This is something different, and I think that is the thing that raises concern.
Mm-hmm. But there does seem to be some people are pointing this out that somewhat of a double standard. We saw, of course, with these sexual harassment charges, Al Franken resigned. Eric Schneiderman, disgusting what we heard.
I got a lot to say about it.
Totally disgusting. But he stepped down. Right. He resigned. Here we go. All this stuff comes out about Donald Trump. He's still in the White House.
I actually just saw there was a post that NARAL put out yesterday. I think
he
it was
just
on Twitter. That basically
denies it, calls them liars, and hires attorneys and keeps on.
Here's why I think Donald Trump gets away with it. And it's not just because the GOP turns a blind eye, and there's a whole other argument to be made about a whole lot of things that the GOP is complicit in, okay? So let's put that aside for a second. I think the reason why Donald Trump does get away with things, although Al Franken, I guess, counters my argument that I'm going to make here, most people don't see Donald Trump as a guy who was planning to be a politician for his whole life. And for those people that try to put themselves out there, like Eric Schneiderman, I'm a champion of women, I'm so great, I'm so progressive, and then, turns out you're the absolute opposite of that, even if you are, anybody, John Edwards, you name it. If you put yourself out there as a family man or a crusader for women, and then you turn out not to be, Trump just is like, I am who I am. I was on The Apprentice. I, been married 3 times, whatever. And people accept that.
Access Hollywood tape. Right.
And people were like, well,
yeah,
he was on The Apprentice. It doesn't matter at the time because he wasn't running for president.
No, I hear that argument. Donald Trump never pretended to be.
I'm not arguing on one way or the other.
Boy, and everybody knew him basically as a
entertainer,
playboy, womanizer, whatever you want, right? Had that reputation, and so they're not surprised.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's why he gets away with it. And that's even the evangelicals are like, well, it's been a journey and all this stuff. It's been a journey for him to find the Lord. So he was in a real different place in 2005 than he is now. It's like he's learned and all this stuff. And that's always what they're saying.
Don't get me started on the evangelicals.
I'm just saying.
I know. But they are the biggest hypocrites going.
No comment.
Why you comment about everything else? Why not comment about that? But this idea that, it's a long journey for him to find the Lord. Oh, yeah, right. And it's going to continue to be a long journey for him to find the Lord.
Hey, everybody's got their own relationship with the Lord now. Don't forget.
That's going to be, I don't know if there's any light at the end of that tunnel at all. How does in terms of, speaking of Donald Trump, this North Korean thing, you've got to say the whole show, and it was a show, right? At one level, that's all it was yesterday, the getting up out there at Andrews Air Force Base at 2:30 in the morning, watching the plane come home. But it was a pretty effective show, wasn't it?
Sure. I was asked about this earlier today when, on a television appearance. And frankly, it doesn't really, people are like, is Trump going to get credit? I don't care who gets credit. I'm glad that these people are home.
Yeah.
I think that the only concern that I have in regards to the quote unquote show.
I go so far as to say he deserves credit.
He does deserve credit.
These 3 prisoners are home,
For this. But I think there's a difference between.
His Jesse Jackson moment.
Okay. There's a difference between, successfully getting these 3 Americans back on American soil and what is to come in the negotiations, I guess, allegedly in Singapore between President Trump
found out, right.
and Kim Jong-un, because at that point, I mean, again, we got their nuclear aspirations are in the North Korean constitution. They still have detainees from other allies like Japan. Are they going to subject themselves to inspections? I mean, there's a whole lot that needs to be answered there. And to Trump's credit, he's gotten farther than pretty much anybody else. So again, I'll give credit where credit is due, but to go so far as to say he needs the Nobel Peace Prize right now is, I mean, a little much.
Yeah. A little getting ahead of the curve here,
Yep.
right? Yeah. No, but just the idea of even agreeing to a summit, I think, bravo, right?
Agreed.
Now that it looks like the summit is actually going to happen, right? Bravo. But there's a lot of to be. I mean, that's a very complicated deal.
It is, and I don't know how many North Korean experts we have right now at the Department of State, at DNI or any. I mean, at this point, I have no idea what kind of bench we have in regards to North Korean experts. Obviously, Pompeo seems to be doing a decent job, but it remains to be seen. And I hope for the best that it works out.
And by the way, I think while we're saying that Donald Trump deserves some credit in terms of as a showman, the way he's playing this, so does Kim Jong-un.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, his going down there and meeting with the president of South Korea, meeting with the president of China
right on the
twice.
heels of the Olympics.
Yeah, and then the Olympics, right? And just the idea that he wants to meet with Donald Trump, and he's pulling off a meeting too in Singapore.
Right. Well, and I just heard something this morning actually that I guess when Pompeo was in North Korea, one of the allies or one of the folks on the North Korean staff was saying, "Yeah, it's all because we want it." So to your point,
it's the two showmen playing off against each other, isn't it?
Exactly.
God, there we are, and I hear that music, and which means we're out of time, and seems like we're just getting started. Hey, Capri Cafaro, thanks so much for coming in.
Absolutely, Bill.
Always
Thanks
great
anytime.
to have you here.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Elizabeth Lower-Basch, William Ayers, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.